Greetings. This is the overview, and I'm your host, Brother Mbogo. Today we're going to take a look at a subject which, over the last couple of years, or last few years, it has been in the news, particularly, well, it's mainly focused in the US. This is the subject of the critical race theory, a subject which has caused some controversy, particularly in the educational systems in the US, in the United States. So anyway, we're going to take a brief breakdown of what critical race theory is and how it can also be applied outside of the US. What is the current idea? I'll give you a brief idea around the critical race theory before I give you its the five tenets, you might call them, or 5 principles of critical race theory. So it's portrayed as an anti-white ideology, although it's mainly it's taking a look at race, basically, race and the legal system. And it's portrayed in such a way that it's a negative, anti-white program, which is somehow designed to criticize and be abusive towards white people. But when you have organizations such as the NAACP, which is the National Association for Advancement of Colored Peoples, and you have political bodies such as the Congressional Black Caucus, that's the organization of black congressmen in the US. Some of the tenets of critical race theory are endorsed by these major black organizations in the US. So it's not a so-called extreme theory. It's something that is acknowledged by much of the black community. So the idea that it is being taught in schools is also incorrect. Yes, there are some issues around race being discussed in schools or taught in schools to give students a better idea of the history of race in the US. But it can't really be called critical race as I'll break it down and we'll see. Anyway, what's the background to critical race theory? Critical race theory began to develop around the 1970s. You have the main activists such as Derek Bell, Alan Friedman, and Richard Delgado. What they realized was, although things like affirmative action came about during the 1960s, and also some civil rights acts during the same period, the race issue hadn't gone away, and there were still issues around race which were not changing as quickly as they would have liked to see. So they began to develop theories to examine race, and particularly looking at the legal system in the US to develop ways of finding solutions to a problem that still exists, or still existed at the time. Well, it still exists now, but they were looking at it back in the 1970s. So the early focus of CRT was on the legal system in the US and the laws which affected the lives of people of color, particularly black people. And even though these laws had gone away, the effects of these laws were still felt in the black communities at the time, and even today. But it broadened out into looking at politics and race, in the education system and race. So now critical race theory covers a broader number of areas, I should say. It was influenced by earlier studies such as critical legal studies, which is looking at the legal system and society as a whole. But CRT began to focus more directly on race. Also, ideas from the Black Power movement and Pan-Africanist scholars such as W.E. Du Bois and Sojourner Truth. So let's look at the 5 basic tenets or principles of critical race theory. As I mentioned before, the group's, what they call him the intellectual father of CRT, Professor Derek Bell. There were other figures such as Kimberly Crenshaw, Mari Matsuda, Patricia Williams, and Richard Delgado. But there are a number of other scholars that were researchers, you could say, into critical race theory. So the first tenet of critical race theory is that racism is ordinary, uncommon. This is basically means that, as any African American person knows or black person knows in the West, that racism is an ordinary feature of life, even though you may not experience it every day, but in certain situations you will experience it. An example of this, Professor Williams, Patricia Williams, and she's an early proponent of CRT. She describes a situation in which she wrote an article for a newspaper, and the editor eliminated or deleted the fact that she was an African American. So the article went like this. It's about a woman who, her herself, she went into a shop, or she was about to enter a shop. And as she was about to enter the shop attendant told her that the shop is closed. The shop is now closed. But as she looked inside the shop, she could see some white people in there still shopping. So to her, well, obviously there was the issue of race here because she was a black woman. They didn't want her to enter the shop, so they said that they're now closed. Yeah, this was early afternoon. But the editor of the article, in the publication that she published the article in, removed the fact that she was a black woman. So if you remove that factor, you would have a distorted view of the article, in that you may just think that the shop was closing early and the people that were still in the shop were about to leave. Because you leave out the racial issue, you get a distorted interpretation of the article, what the article was trying to say. So that's an example of race being ordinary, uncommon. The second tenet is interest convergence, when the interests of white elites in particular align with the black majority or the black community in terms of dealing with the race issue. Then it only aligns really when it's going to serve some interest for the white community. The white elite, or say, let's have a look at the white business world, for example. A few years ago, you had the George Floyd situation. And white companies at the time, because race was a major issue in the news, white companies at the time could only benefit from criticizing racial prejudice in the US. If there were a company that had certain racist practices, they would have also certain activities within their own companies which were deemed to be racist. It would be in their benefit to criticize those activities at a time where the general trend was to criticize race. So in that sense, they were seeing the situation as something that they could benefit from by engaging with the same line of thinking as the anti-racists. Otherwise, they may not have looked at their own companies and looking at some of the activities that their companies were practicing in terms of race. Tenet number 3, race is a social construct. This one is based on the idea that ideas around race are socially constructed. For example, in the 18th century, you had the Dred Scott v. Sanford court case, in which Dred Scott sued the executor of the estate where he was once a slave to be acknowledged as a citizen. He lost the case at the time, but later on he was granted. So basically, what it's saying is that blacks, free or enslaved, were not citizens of the US because of a particular law at the time. Also, an example of this is in 1935, non-minorities were denied a social security and excluded from unions. So blacks and other minorities were excluded from certain social institutions because of race. They were deemed not viable to be accepted in these institutions. So that's a form of what you might call constructing race, looking at race in a particular way. Or the most commonly one known amongst African Americans would be Africans being seen as 3/5 of a man, which was part of the US law at one time. And number 4, storytelling and counter-storytelling. These are basically narrative. The narrative of white superiority. is a story, and the counter story to this would be the African story, the African perspective of things, where you create your own narrative and history of yourselves, and you put it out into the public to counter the negative, what you might call stereotypes of African people. And then number 5, whites as the recipients of civil rights legislation. Most best example of this is affirmative action. Affirmative action was created to increase the number of minorities in white-dominated institutions such as universities. So if the population of a district is 10% African Americans, then a university in that district would also have to have a 10% population of African Americans. So it was meant to bolster the number of African Americans in certain institutions, or to help the increase in the number of minorities in certain institutions. How this would benefit whites, or allow whites to be recipients of civil rights legislation, is that this same institution that allows 10% of African Americans need not go beyond that 10%. So if you're an institution and you didn't want too many blacks to be in that institution, you'd stick to the quotas, as you might call them, of how many ethnic minorities or black people are supposed to be in that institution. So in that way, your institution would benefit, in that you would no need to go past the quotas or the state quotas or district quotas that were set in place for your district. So you'd benefit in a sense by restricting the number of blacks by sticking to the particular quota. So those are the 5 tenets of critical race theory. Anyway, let's look at race and the legal system on an international scale. We know that the legal aspects of race in America had certain factors such as redlining. Redlining was a policy which looked at a city and the districts or the neighborhoods of a city, and put red lines around particular districts in which they thought the people living in those districts should be restricted from financial credit or the access to finance, because they were deemed incapable of repaying a loan, for example, or their social situation was deemed to indicate that they would not be good people to lend money to. So people, predominantly Black Americans, African American communities, didn't get access to credit to, say, buy a house or start a business or elevate their lives somehow. So this is a factor that kept the African American populations in some level of decline, not decline, it's subjugation, you might say, over a long period. And these policies, even after they were repealed, they had certain the long-term consequences of these laws have kept a certain level of economic subjugation on Black communities. And it's not just financially, health-wise, what you would find it. There's a report here, basically. There's a paper called The Modern Day Consequences of Historic Redlining, Finding a Path Forward, authored by researchers at the Medical College of Wisconsin. This details the effects of historical redlining of Black neighborhoods in the US. It focuses on the medical consequences of such policies. And some of the medical consequences of these were high rates of diabetes, early mortality due to heart disease, and you had social consequences of these being people within these neighborhoods faced lower capacity for social advancement because of lack of access to money and credit, and limited potential to attain higher income and credit, as I mentioned. So redlining as a policy had a social and medical and financial effect on African American communities even up to today. This is in the US, but you could argue that similar policies existed in Africa during the colonial period. On the African continent, you had a version of redlining, what you could call redlining. Um, in South Africa, which is the most obvious place you would think of, is the apartheid system. But throughout the continent, cities such as Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, Lagos in Nigeria, Kampala, Accra in Ghana, all experienced forms of discrimination within the cities during the colonial period. They had a system, we could call it a system, where the Europeans would construct cities. Even these major cities were constructed based on the idea of what they call white cities, cities designed for the white Europeans, colonialists, to live in. And they were designed in such a way that the areas where Europeans lived were spacious and affluent and well developed, whereas the areas developed for the blacks to live, these are what they might call the ordinary workers, were very cramped and developed in such a way that would deter the African men from bringing their families in. So the cities were designed to benefit the Europeans, and the Africans were kept in such conditions that they were not encouraged to move to the cities, basically, or enjoy life in the city. They're only there to work, basically. So those are two ideas around legal structures that benefited whites historically. And that is the redlining and the structures of African cities during the colonial period. But looking at CRT today, what you find, there's a backlash against race-conscious education in schools. Over the years since the civil rights period, there's been some level of, not African history, but knowledge or teaching about the black experience in terms of, if you look at people like Martin Luther King and the civil rights period, there's some education in schools about that, which also included books written by certain authors like Alice Walker and Maya Angelou. What we have found, what you have seen over the last few years, is a situation where this education or practice or certain methods used to teach young people in certain areas of the US in schools about race. There are some complaints. For example, whites parents are complaining that their children are being separated in schools. There's a method that some schools are using, particularly in New York, where they separate the students into racial groups. It's a practice which is voluntary. Not all students would engage in it, but it's a practice to separate them, just to give them some experience of what segregation is like. Parents have been complaining about this, and this is one of the practices to criticize, or they're saying that it's part of the CRT program, Critical Race Theory program. So they're arguing that there's some kind of white agenda in schools to make whites feel ashamed. As some of the children going through this experience have gone home and said they feel ashamed to be white. I think the practice was meant to bring some kind of awareness to the issue of race in schools. If they go home feeling ashamed and talking to their parents about this issue, then maybe that's part of the program. Maybe the program is working to a certain extent. But the parents are complaining. Not only the parents, some school boards have gone to the extent of banning such educational practices in schools and removing books by many African American authors. Some well-known authors as well, like Maya Angelou, as I said. And even a book about Michelle Obama, the wife of the former president, Barack Obama. A book about her was removed. Such is the extremes that people would go to in wanting to remove anything to do with race from their school curriculum. A bit crazy, really. So this is more or less a push to remove any discussion of race from schools because certain people will feel uncomfortable if such discussions are held. At the university level, recently on the 23rd of June this year, this affirmative action policy, which I had mentioned earlier, was repealed by the Supreme Court. So educational establishments no longer need to enforce any kind of quota of African Americans or any minority in the education in their education system, which means some would argue that this would benefit white students because they can even, as I mentioned, the 10% example earlier, it means they no longer even have to have 10% of blacks in the university. It can be much lower than that. But as a backlash to that, there's another policy that universities have or had. It's called the legacy admissions. Legacy admissions is based on the idea that former students of an institution, their siblings or any or relatives connected to them that are coming to university will get automatic admission because some family member of theirs or somebody connected to them had attended the university earlier, at a previous time. But some universities have decided to, as a backlash to the removal of this affirmative action, they have decided to remove this legacy admissions structure, as they see it as that's something that has always been a racist structure. So they removed it, which is a good thing in a sense. But anyway, let's move on. Going to look at another factor of CRT. So we've looked at some of the more recent happenings in terms of what's happening in the schools and the fact that parents are pushing back against race education in schools. But also another CRT concept, this concept of whiteness as property. This is discussed by a CRT scholar, Cheryl Harris, and she has a paper called Whiteness as Property, in which she examines the perceptions around whiteness and blackness as property, because blackness as property in the days of slavery deemed blacks as a form of property which you could own, you could buy and sell, and you could even use African slaves as collateral for loans. Whereas white identity was seen as something positive. If you're a white person, you're meant to be treated in a particular way, and you had certain rights, the right to vote, the right to own land and own property, and such forth. If you go back historically and look at some of the legal acts which affected race as far back as, I think it's the 16th century. In 1676, after this Bacon's rebellion was a rebellion where blacks and whites, because at the time you had black indentured servants and also white indentured servants, and although there were some blacks as slaves as well. So these both joined together to fight against the establishment. And this rebellion lasted about a year. When it was finally put down, they began to bring in legislation to separate the blacks and the whites. So in the 1682 Act, it stipulated that all blacks imported into the country should be deemed as slaves. It was made a crime for a white person to marry a black person, and this was considered an imprisonable offense. In 1723, the anti-assembly law prevented blacks from meeting and gathering for social events. In 1750, an act was brought in to define the difference between a slave and a servant. Slaves were classed as property, whilst white indentured laborers were given new rights. So in order to separate the blacks and the whites, they classified blacks in a certain sense and then began to give whites more rights. So the poor whites would lean towards their richer colleagues, you might say. In fact, much of the rights that we see today in the U.S. only came about fully in the 1960s. In 1964, you had the Civil Rights Act. In 1965, you had the Voting Rights Act. Even though they were supposed to be able to vote much earlier than that, there were still restrictions or games played, you could say, to prevent blacks from voting. But the full Voting Rights Act, for example, came in 1964 at 5. And then you had the Fair Housing Act of 1968. These encouraged um, blacks to be able to have certain facility or certain rights, which was to some extent already there, but they had to be enforced or enhanced by firmer rights, because it, even if a right is there, it doesn't mean that the white establishment is going to abide by it. So that was a brief look at CRT. So it's a method of, basically CRT, critical race theory, is a method of examining Western legal structures, and it encourages the transformation of these discriminatory practices. Um, yes, it encourages the looking at these structures and finding ways of overcoming these bias structures, which, as Professor Derek Bell states, he doesn't believe racism will ever leave the US. It will always be there to some extent. It's somehow ingrained in white society. You can continue to struggle to overcome it, but it will never fully be overcome. And that's one of the arguments against CRT, is that it sees race as something fixed into society, which many Europeans don't want to acknowledge, that there's some element of racist in their own structures and the way they behave. So that's a brief look at CRT anyway, and we'll look at another subject next week.